you can, churches can grow without going, but they can't go without growing. Not sustainably, not at a clip like you guys have seen. I would love to hear from you, man. What are your impressions of just kind of that because everything's a reaction, and we're sort of reacting a little bit against maybe we've gone way far into the disciple-making growth side or going side, and maybe we want to try to make sure that we're keeping that connected to the growth side. What have your thoughts of the whole thing been over the last year as we've been doing Breaking Barriers?
Well, I mean, genuinely, I'm not just saying it because I'm on your podcast, but I've been super thankful for what how you've really championed that. I feel like the Lord's raised you up to help say that, and I'm 100% in support of it without any caveats. You and I, I'm just slightly older than you. I mean, not much, 1, 2, 3 years, maybe
10 years.
Yeah, okay, but we came out of it really is. You kind of come out of a context,
right?
And I definitely came out of a context where everything in that was celebrated was church growth. I mean, it was the Bill Hybels and it was Rick Warren. There's a lot of great things that we've learned from that movement, but it really was this emphasis on, man, we're just growing these audiences. And what I pointed out this morning is, when you compare what happened in the early church, Rodney Stark's book, The Rise of Christianity, he explains it. But at the end of the first century, you got less than 10,000 Christians. But at the end of the second century, the church fathers are like, hey, we're geographically broad, but we're still numerically insignificant. And by the time you get to 112 years later, you got so many Christians that, over half the Roman Empire identifies themselves as Christian. And Rodney Stark just asked how. How does that happen? Because they didn't have any of the things we think that we need. No auditoriums, no printing presses, no big stadiums. He said it just happens because they were all committed to multiplication. Every believer believed it was their responsibility to make disciples, and every church thought it was their responsibility to multiply. In some ways, because they didn't have the official mission boards and all that sort of stuff, it put it back on the churches to multiply. And I compare that to what's happening really in the last 100 years of our church, culture in America, where you've had the biggest auditoriums and the biggest audiences, bigger than the apostles would have ever dreamed of. And I'm in support of that. But during that 100 years, the percentage of Americans that are in church every weekend has gone down, not up.
Yeah.
And it just shows you that kind of like big, kind of expansive thing without the accompanying commitment to multiple leaders. It's inflating and more than it is the one thing that God says is going to be the key for the multiplication. So, all that to say is, I love the fact that you are putting the emphasis on this syllable now, because I think it's something that really has gotten out of balance. So,
this is Breaking Barriers, where we help pastors and churches grow so that they can go.
All right. Hey, guys. Welcome to the Breaking Barriers podcast. My name is Andrew Hopper, and I'm the lead pastor at Mercy Hill Church. Have the opportunity today to be on site at the Pastors Conference in North Carolina with one of our awesome speakers that just came off the stage, Pastor JD Greear. JD, thanks for being with us, man.
Yeah, the Pastors Conference that you were running and doing a great job with.
Thanks, man. So our Pastors Conference theme, has kind of like gone piggyback off of our Breaking Barriers idea, right?
Yeah.
So it's about growing churches, or can be going churches, and you can't have one without the other. We always say churches can grow without going, but they can't go without growing. Not sustainably, not at a clip like you guys have seen. I would love to hear from you, man. What are your impressions of just kind of that because everything's a reaction, and we're sort of reacting a little bit against maybe we've gone way far into the disciple-making growth side or going side, and maybe we want to try to make sure that we're keeping that connected to the growth side. What have your thoughts of the whole thing been over the last year as we've been doing Breaking Barriers?
Well, I mean, genuinely, I'm not just saying it because I'm on your podcast, but I've been super thankful for what how you've really championed that. I feel like the Lord's raised you up to help say that, and I'm 100% in support of it without any caveats. You and I, I'm just slightly older than you. I mean, not much, 1, 2, 3 years, maybe
10 years.
Yeah, okay, but we came out of it really is. You kind of come out of a context,
right?
And I definitely came out of a context where everything in that was celebrated was church growth. I mean, it was the Bill Hybels and it was Rick Warren and Rick. There's a lot of great things that we've learned from that movement, but it really was this emphasis on, man, we're just growing these audiences. And what I pointed out this morning is, when you compare what happened in the early church, Rodney Stark's book, The Rise of Christianity is where this comes from. He explains it, I'll make it real quick, but at the end of the first century, you got less than 10,000 Christians. But at the end of the second century, the church fathers are like, hey, we're geographically broad, but we're still numerically insignificant. And by the time you get to 112 years later, you got so many Christians that, over half the Roman Empire identifies themselves as Christian. And Rodney Stark just asked how? How does that happen? Because they didn't have any of the things we think that we need. No auditoriums, no printing presses, no big stadiums. He said it just happens because they were all committed to multiplication. Every believer believed it was their responsibility to make disciples, and every church thought it was their responsibility to multiply. In some ways, because they didn't have the official mission boards and all that sort of stuff, it put it back on the churches to multiply. And I compare that to what's happening really in the last 100 years of our church, culture in America, where you've had the biggest auditoriums and the biggest audiences, bigger than the apostles would have ever dreamed of. And I'm in support of that, but during that 100 years, the percentage of Americans that are in church every weekend has gone down, not up.
Yeah.
And it just shows you that kind of like big, kind of expansive thing without the accompanying commitment to multiple leaders. It's inflating and more than it is the one thing that God says is going to be the key, for the multiplication. So, all that to say is, I love the fact that you are putting the emphasis on this syllable now, because I think it's something that really has gotten out of balance. So,
but it's coming out of a context where it was out of balance before. I mean, so it's from what you're saying, right?
Yeah.
Like my whole ministry life, 10 years later, has been kind of steeped in where the growth is sort of assumed, and we need to get people talking about multiplying and going.
You are exactly.
And so then, and so that's.
But now yours, because now what's really popular is let's talk about why growth is, it means that you're compromising.
Right.
Dean said it today. It's like, let's just act like if somebody's baptizing a lot, that automatically means they must not be. Yeah. They must not be counted.
Right.
And I look at like the early church, Acts 2, when 3,000 people get saved in a day. I'm sure that created some chaos in the church.
Absolutely.
And some people slipped in there that maybe, shouldn't have been baptized. But there really are. I mean, a lot of things we treat as contradictions or as enemies. What God wants, what God sees as friends.
Yeah.
One of the things that I've really tried to work with our staff on is that, if we don't want to grow deep or wide as if those are contradictions.
Right.
Because if you try to grow wide without growing that deep, you're not really growing that wide, because heaven counts disciples, not converts. But if you try to grow deep without growing wide, then you're not really growing that deep, because depth in the gospel is going to lead to width in evangelism every time.
Right.
Spurgeon's a great example for us, because here's a guy that, obviously he's everybody's favorite deep preacher, very, doctrinally sound. But he said, I would rather bring one sinner to faith in Jesus Christ than unpack all the divine mysteries of the Word.
Right.
And his whole thing is we've got to do it in order to, to reach people. So, where we are in the conversation, I mean, we always got to be careful overreacting.
Yeah.
To use Rodney Stark again, he said, when you look at it, it really, what happened in the early church was pretty simple math. It's like the compound interest principle.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm not taking away the supernatural, wind of the Holy Spirit in it. He said, but when people multiply, it just works a whole lot faster than addition. So I love how you say it. You say, in order to be able to go, we've got to grow, but you should never grow. You can grow without going.
Yeah, you can.
And either one of those is going to lead you to a bad place.
Yeah, exactly, man. So I would tell you, I think it's good you're on the podcast, because I know you listen to every one of our podcasts, every minute of the whole thing. I know that. So you've already heard all this before. But no, in all seriousness, I mean, we refer to our time at the summit all the time, man, because I feel like you guys, the culture that you created, that I was fortunate enough to fall into and be equipped by, was it really is I mean, it's both all the time, right? And one of the things I think is so cool about the summit is, Pastor Bobby always goes back to this, is, if you're in that high discipleship, high going. I put those things together in terms of just mobilizing the individual believer to go out. Some of the stuff that the summit does, you might think is the smoke machines, the huge Easter service or whatever.
Right.
And you want to put you guys in a box. And at the same time, your church is one of the most high challenge environments that there is in terms of calling people to go to the hardest places. And I just think that's, you don't have to choose, you know? And you have a whole talk you do on this about balance. I mean, what are some other things that are that way that people want to choose and you have to say, no, you got to hold those things together. They're you're setting them up like enemies, but they're friends.
Yeah. So, before I give you a couple others, let me just get, one of the things, in addition to challenging people to go to hard mission things, we really want to take membership and church discipline, that stuff seriously. And those are all things that tend to go with, people think like, well, that's one kind of church versus the kind that reaches people. And I don't know, it's just, it's easy to get on podcast if you go to one extreme or the other. Balance is sometimes boring with people, but it really is. It makes for a healthier church. You and I are two pastors talking about this. Our messages, I really do see them as really complementary. Yeah. And you've actually helped me sharpen the message that I'm giving, because to say, I'm always speaking out of the context of a church that has 14,000 people on the weekend.
Right.
And because of that, I tend to say, well, let me just make sure people understand it's not all about that. Like, here's why doctrine matters and membership matters and church discipline and all that kind of stuff. And I think, just in doing that, you correctly have pointed out on this podcast, which I listen to every day through tears.
That's right. That's exactly right. I knew that.
It helped me, say, like, hey, I actually think there's a mixed message being sent to people, especially right now that are, just kind of coming into ministry of like, man, a statement that irritates me more than any other is that whole, I know you've heard it, if you worry about the depth of your church, God will worry about the width. Yeah. And I'm like, that's great. First of all, you can't control the depth anyway. God brings that.
It's all
God. But what kind of, none of the apostles would have said that. They would have said, we are trying to think about the width of the church in the world. So you mentioned some other ones that we throw out. I mean, some of them are more theological, some of them more practical. One I always think about is like the whole, should your church service be really Pentecostal free kind of thing? Like, let's move in the Spirit, or should it be more liturgical where the prayers are and the things are being given to you? So there's a lot of script, which is, and the answer is it's got to be both of them. I grew up more in the tradition of it being very, kind of rote. We overcorrected to where now it's just like, man, let's just have 40 minutes of whatever the Spirit wants to do and a loose worship set. Now we're seeing that a lot of people recognize, hey, a worship pastor asking a body of people, how do you feel right now, and where does your heart want to go? That's not what I come to church for. I come to church because I feel like a depraved sinner who desperately needs grace, and I need grace spoken to me in the, sometimes they're written prayers and old creeds or verses and that kind of stuff. So I think that's a balance that we try to hold. A really practical one is this whole, the generation I grew up in, it was like burn out for Jesus, like, work yourself to the bone. Well, there's been another, you come along and it's like we all need rest. And if you don't leave church every day with tears in your eyes, thinking about how joy, then you're doing something wrong. And you're like, really, both those things are there. There's I want to get to heaven, and when Jesus wipes a tear from my eye, I want him to wipe some sweat from my brow. I want to work hard, but I also realize that God made me as a dependent creature, and that means I need rhythms and rest. And so those are other things that it's just so easy to go into extreme sell books. Extremes get you invited to things, but extremes don't lead. They don't produce healthy, sustainable churches.
Well, I appreciate that so much, and that's what I want to keep trying to do, is not, because I feel like I'm reacting to a culture where I just want to go all in on growth. Right. But I'm just trying to fight very hard to keep those two things together, growing and going. All right, so let's get into your talk a little bit. This is kind of the value add section here for people that weren't able to come, because the summit is wanting to become one of the most multiplying movement in America, and I love that. I've always been drawn to big dream, big vision from the summit, and I think we put lids on things that don't need to be there. So you got no problem just saying it out loud. There's going to be critics of that, but you got no problem saying it. And that's coming on the backs of, you're reaching people are growing, but you guys want to multiply everything. You can't do that without the Spirit's leading. That was one of your big points from today.
Yeah. I always add, when I say we want to be the most multiplying church in America, I always add now, and we want to help you be better than us. So I'm really not trying to be number one at anything, but just to say of all the things that we could excel in.
So it's not a competition.
It's not a competition.
But you do want to win.
As long as I'm winning, it's not a competition.
That's right. That's right.
I did ask. I have a guy. I won't say his name, but you're gonna figure who it is. So their church had a humongous Easter.
Right.
And in the 30,000s or whatever.
Right.
And our church had a measly 22,000. Okay, so just But I told him, I said, the churches that we've planted in the last 10 years, our total attendance, because that includes yours, our total attendance there was 78,000 compared to his 34,000. Right. And I was like, and the gap between you and me is just going to get bigger every year.
It's exponentially going to grow.
It's because now we got multiple points. Yeah. So, there's good and bad competition. So anyway, but all we're trying to say with that is, of all the things to excel in, that's the one we want to put the most energy in. Mm-hmm. Because that really and you brought up the Spirit, when you look at the Spirit's plan for the church, Jesus says a remarkable thing to his disciples. He tells them multiple times in that last discourse that it would be more advantageous for him to go away if it meant that they got the Holy Spirit.
Right.
And you just think about how, we just kind of read right over that, but you think about how ridiculous that must have been to those first disciples, because they're thinking they've been with Jesus now for 3 years, and they're going to look. That would be an awesome thing to have Jesus here on earth with us. But what he was saying is the collective impact of the Spirit raising up multiple leaders would be greater than if the Spirit stayed concentrated on any one person, even if the person was Jesus. And what I pointed out is how we celebrate church growth turns that principle on its head. Because we act like the greatest ministries are where one guy can get thousands of people thronging to hear him every week. Mm-hmm. When Jesus said, no, even if I was your pastor, it'd be better for you to celebrate the sending and the raising up than it is just a lot of people saying, what an amazing preacher teacher.
And it's not. We want to put those things in a competition with one another. Mm-hmm. What I say, I love to hear what you think about this, is man, there's just a sequential order to this. Lead measure, lag measure.
Yep.
Because whether it's thousands or hundreds or whatever, that crowd ends up being a lot of the times where the harvest is coming from. That ends up being the ones that go.
Right.
So it's not like one is good, the other is bad. It's just that we tend to stop short with the crowd and the growth, and we just stop there instead of the further disciple making all the way to now they need to go, right?
Yeah, and I love how you do it. You did it again today, and you're kind of opening when you were setting the table for us. But I can't remember the exact numbers you used, so I'll just make them up.
Yeah.
But they're close to this. You're like, for every, I do know this, for every one long-term missionary, it takes 100 short-term trips.
Yeah.
For every one short-term trip, you got to have, let's just say, 100 people in your church. To get 100 people in your church, we know that means it's going to be about 1,000 first-time guests, about 100 of those end up becoming members. Well, to get 1,000 first-time guests, that takes 20,000 webpage views. Right. And we don't want to turn the whole thing into science, because we know the Spirit of God is in all this. But on the other hand, your lead measure and lag measure, you're saying, hey, when you're sending somebody to the mission field, there was a whole set of things that people did that produced that. And it's just as wrong to take the Spirit out of the last thing as it would be to take it out of the first thing. Meaning, the Spirit's the one who calls somebody to long-term missions. The Spirit's also the one that enables you to have a website that encounters people, that draws them in. That's the Spirit of God first working in them. And so our work and God's work are simultaneous the entire time.
Yeah. And
we've got to do all of them and not try to say, well, that's fleshly because you're trying to get web views, as opposed to this is spiritual, trying to get missionaries.
That's exactly what we do, though. I mean, I experienced this whenever we have a 2032 vision at Mercy Hill, 5,000 baptisms, 500 missionaries. We say missionary 2 years or more, just like you guys, with the exception of if a student goes on a gap year, we're going to count that too. So it's a baptized believer that goes out for 2 years or more. And we've just done that to kind of hold those things together, 5,000 baptisms, 500 missionaries, because that's what our ratio has sort of been. And when I've shared that, I've had multiple times where people were like, the missions one's great, but how could you put a number on baptisms, brother?
Right.
And you're like, how could you put a number on missionaries?
Exactly.
Right? How does that? But that's sort of what I have found is the further you get up the lead measure, the more people want to nitpick and get really weird about it.
Yeah, that's
I don't know why, but all right, so that's really good. So we also talked some, and you talked some about becoming, again, multiplying church in America, not a competition, but you certainly want to win. All right, so you talked about the idea of post-Christian culture and trying to use strategies that are exclusively, Christian culture strategies, right?
Yep.
And how we've got to be able to. Those are great, but we got to see them as part of a puzzle, not the whole pot, the whole puzzle.
Yep.
Like those Easter or whatever. I mean, our gatherings are important. They are. We would say they're the most important thing still right now. It may not be that way in 100 years.
Right.
So flesh that out some.
Yeah. So the idea behind it is that there's a growing number of people in America who are not going to casually just saunter their way into church, because it's just a totally different world. And I compare it to when I was overseas. I lived in a Muslim unreached people group, and there were mosques all around and I never even considered going, Andrew. I wouldn't have gone if I were sad or lonely. I wouldn't have gone if the imam was really funny. I wouldn't have gone if they'd had Disney-esque, why would I go to a mosque? I would never think I'm sad, need to go to a mosque. And so it didn't matter how good his sermons were, I weren't going to hear those sermons. In America, increasingly, you got 28% of the people that identify as nuns, N-O-N-E-S. Great Britain, which is much farther along than we are, I quoted this stat that 70% say they don't anticipate ever going into a church other than a museum. They just don't ever think they will take them into a church. And so that means if you're really going to engage them with the gospel, it means you really do have to equip your people to carry the gospel to them. Now, sometimes when I hear people talk about this, and maybe I sound like this sometimes, it's almost like people assume we're already in wherever Great Britain is or even beyond that. And I'm like, no. I mean, the most evangelistic thing that we do right now that nets the most conversions and baptism is the weekend message. And people are still, we still have people stream in on Easter, and even when we tell people it's going to be a Sunday to invite people, we still have these. I pointed out to you, we baptized our 10,000th person a few weeks ago, and you said correctly, I bet you 95% of those came through listening to a sermon, and I think you're probably correct. I also tell another story where in the message about a group that is very kind of, they're not going to probably come to our church, but a guy started a little Bible study at his gym, and through those relationships has brought him to Christ. And I know that it's going to have to be both if we really are going to reach all of the people in our community. So yes, we put a lot of effort into our weekend stuff, and then we also at the same time are saying, man, we got to equip people because we got to grow the pie and not just fight for that right now. What is it? Let me do my math real quick. 72% who would still be open to going to church.
Yeah, I do think my mind. I just have a little bit of a. You can just react to this. It feels to me like what I see to be true in our culture right now. And I know you lived in Indonesia. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about where we are. It just seems like what I read in the book of Acts is actually kind of mirroring what we're seeing now. What I mean by that is, are there one-on-one evangelistic encounters? Philippian jailer, you see Jesus' woman at the well, or in the book of Acts, you see the slave girl, things like that. Yeah, absolutely. But you already mentioned on this podcast, you got 3,000 coming to the sermon, coming to faith under Peter's sermon, or you got 5,000 here or whatever. It seems like most of the people, I'm not talking about on a weekend service, but it still was the preaching of the word. That unlocked the heart that God breathed on. And we see that today too. Most people that come to Christ, they do so when there's some kind of, there's a crowd and there's a message. Even your CrossFit gym illustration you mentioned, that's still not just one-on-one over coffee over 2 years.
Right.
There's a group dynamic to that. And I'm not saying it's got to be a church with 1,000 people. There might be 20 people.
Yep.
But there's somebody proclaiming, there's some group I don't know. What do you think about that?
I feel like you just did two different things there. Okay, so the 3,000 and 5,000 in Acts 2 and 4, that is a very Jewish audience. That was almost like a pre-Christian, very religious. You don't see anywhere in like Philippi and Acts 16 them gathering groups of 3,000 and 5,000 to do that. That really is a lot more one-on-one or one-on small group type of thing.
I wouldn't say one-on-one. I would say one-on group.
Well, Lydia was one-on-one. Slave Girl was one-on-one. Philippian Jailer was one-on-one. All three people that got there were one-on-one.
No, Lydia, I just preached on this. Lydia is with a group of people. Paul comes just like he would go to a synagogue, and he sits down by the river in Philippi because there's no synagogue, and he opens the word of God to them.
Well,
so it's you're right. You're totally right. It's not 3,000.
Right.
But it is an environment where there's a group and somebody seems to be proclaiming. It's not like 2 years of relationship
why wouldn't
one-on-one.
you say that they were proclaiming one-on-one? That's also proclaiming.
Well, every time someone proclaims in Acts, it happens within 30 seconds. It's not a 3-year relationship that I'm trying to win you over to do this.
But like Acts
and there's a group.
Acts 8 Ethiopian Union, that's one-on-one.
Yeah, it is, totally. And I mentioned
he's
that.
proclaiming.
Yeah,
he's proclaiming. So I wouldn't try to draw a distinction there. So
but most people that are sitting with someone doing one-on-one evangelism would separate that majorly from like a teaching.
See, I don't know if what I experienced the other night, this Bible study, was more similar to what I do on Sunday or what somebody does one-on-one.
You think it's some kind of way in the middle?
But a little bit more toward the one-on-one, because it's like this. What do you
Right.
guys think about that? It was. I mean, he had a plan, but it was very engaging. To use the Lydia thing, what Paul did, which is interesting, is when he goes to these cities, he always headed to the Jewish synagogue.
Right.
So he headed back for that kind of and then he knew that when they came to Christ, then they would bring the other people to faith in Christ. So I think for me, I go into a city. Let's say, what's the most secular city in the United States? Seattle, or maybe. So you go out there. What if we were starting there? I would go to the place of prayer, the Lydia's place of prayer. That's going to be where a lot of Christians are. I'm going to gather them, and I'm going to say, your lost friends need to hear about Jesus.
Yeah.
Now, some of them they're just going to bring to hear me, and that's great. I think in a place like Seattle, you have a lot of people say, I don't know. I mean, like church, that feels weird. Is that are they maybe a Republican? All this kind of stuff. And they'll probably do the Bible study, there, that kind of.
Yeah.
And that is, I think, that kind of balance of if you got people that are doing all the Bill Hybels, let's just make the most amazing entertaining hour for an hour. Yeah, that's probably not going to work. But it's also, you're right. It's just, I love how Leslie Newbigin, who literally coined the word missional, says this. He said, in Acts, evangelism is a group of people gathering around a group of Christians to say what is happening among you people, and somebody standing up to explain it.
Yeah.
Which is a kind of a proclamation. He literally coined the word missional.
Yeah, I love that.
Is saying that a lot of Acts evangelism is attractional.
Yeah. I don't disagree with that at all. I mean, I think that what we do many times, I think, is we champion. When I say the one-on-one, I really think that most evangelism trainings and things like that I have been to, they really are. When I say one-on-one, that's what I mean. Like they're trying to get at, man, you have one friend over time. Then you end up in a 3 circles conversation with them or a bridge diagram, which is great, right?
Yeah.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
It's just not how the vast majority of people in our culture come to Christ. And I think it's not the way that the vast majority of people in the book of Acts came to Christ.
Yeah, and so let me jump to the mission field.
Yeah.
So if you go to the mission field, to the place where I was, if I started a church with Christians, because there are people from different people groups that are Christians, if I started that and I were preaching there every week, the people that I was there to reach, the Muslims, they probably wouldn't come into that church unless it was just after a long time of building a relationship. However, it's not just one-on-one. That's not the mission strategy they tell you to do. They always say it's easier to group people and win them than it is to win them and group them. So what I would do is start an out-of-church Bible study where we're going to look through the Old Testament prophets and see. So there you've got that kind of hybrid that's neither the one-on-one conversation on the plane next to the guy, but it's also not the classic in-church preaching type thing. Right. And I don't know if you want to call it a hybrid or whatever. I look at it a little bit more, because it's outside the church. Yeah. I look at it a little bit more in the category of the one-on-one. You're thinking it's a little bit more of a, and the answer is it's going to be
it's yes.
of both.
And I think it's a good point on this podcast, because I think that we just lean on the weekend service because we're like, well, that's already built in. And there's going to be hundreds of lost people that are coming in. But the absolute truth is, like this past week, I had a chance to go preach at for Reynolds in Winston. It was like a workplace.
Yep.
They've started this thing, and I'm like, that feels very much Book of Acts. You're in but it's still a proclaiming environment. There's people there, but it's outside the church. The first time I ever heard that was actually heard a guy talk about that was actually a guy y'all brought in way back at the summit. I think his name was Paul Warsher. Older guy.
Yeah.
He was doing preaching points. That's what he was doing. He was saying, man, so he goes in and forms groups in neighborhoods, on ball teams, all that kind of stuff. But the express purpose is what you said with New Begin, missional. It was lost people come in, but we're still going to proclaim.
Right.
It doesn't look like a church service,
right.
but it is going to be a proclamation.
Yeah, so I think here, I think Acts 16, there really is something. I think that's a good model for us that kind of covers all the bases. Because you got 3 people that basically come to faith in Christ there. You got Lydia. Lydia comes to Christ through one of Paul's, let's just think of it as small group Bible study.
Yep.
It's outside of church, but he said he went to the place of prayer, and she was already a religious-y person.
Right, she was a seeker.
Right? Okay, and so that's, and I think you're correct. You would say that's you group more than, but it's outside of church. The second one is you got this servant girl who we assume becomes a believer, because she gets delivered. She'd never come into one of those Bible studies.
Right.
And she's definitely not coming to church. She's literally a slave. She gets saved by Paul getting involved in her life, freeing her from an economic and spiritual oppression, which I think there's a large part of our city that we got to do that with. Then you got the third one. The Philippian jailer represents to me like a cynic. He's part of the ruling class. Caesar gave jails to retired generals, so he probably was a Roman general. He's not coming to the Bible study. He's very cynical toward Paul, but he gets saved because he sees Paul's incredible joy in the midst of suffering and Paul's radical generosity.
Yeah, compassion.
Compassion when he came back for him. And you're like, that's how that person gets saved.
Right.
And so we don't want to ignore the first strategy, but we also don't want to act like the first strategy with Lydia is going to reach the servant girls or the...
That's exactly right. You need it. You need it all.
Yep.
You need it all. But you can't... we live in an environment where it's almost like the Philippian jailer and the slave girl is elevated, and the Lydia thing is kind of
she's trash. Don't worry about her.
It's like her salvation is like not as cool or something. And
if you got Lydia's coming to your church, you're doing something wrong.
So we got to get away from that, man. I don't want to take any more time. JD, thank you so much, man, for all you do, for being here with us. And that's it. Hey guys, if you are listening to this podcast, man, check out our private Facebook group where we're going to get a chance to chop up a lot of church pragmatics, and we'll see you on the next one.